Good afternoon. My name is Kim Anderson. I'm the coordinator of the Montana Festival of the Book, and I'd like to welcome you all here today. This is the first of 5 different events we have going on during the festival celebrating James Welch and his work. And it is my pleasure right now to introduce to you a scholar, a good friend, and a great life partner, Lois Welch.
It's my pleasure to, I actually offered to introduce this reading of Jim's poems by all his friends. Not all of them, a good bunch of them. And I am going to proceed on the assumption that I don't need to tell you either about Jim Welch or that I don't need to give you the official biographies of these writers whose bios are all in the program anyhow. I want to just focus on the poems, and they're talking about his poems and his relation to Jim over the years, but in particular relation to the poems. And I wanted to start by telling you, I think we have out in the lobby copies of the new edition of Writing the Earth Boy 40, which I'm really pleased to have persuaded the editor at Viking Penguin, Jim's editor there, to reissue it in time for this festival. And I think it's a beautiful book, and it has a grand introduction by his great friend, the poet James Tate. So I'm glad that we can celebrate that. I wanted to tell you that this is the 6th edition of Writing the Earth Boy 40. It's had kind of a tortured existence in a funny sort of way. The first one, this one, with Mount Olympus on the front, was put out by World Publishing in 1971 and was basically ground up and poured into the Hudson before it was ever circulated. And when Jim went on his first reading tour, he didn't know that they always had copies of books, but people wanted copies and there weren't any. And so that was a kind of fiasco. But soon, Harper and Row in 1976 put out another version of it. And then for a long time, it was out of print. And in 1990, Confluence Press at Lewis Clark College in Idaho put out a copy, and then Carnegie Mellon put one out in 1997, and then the French put out a bilingual version in 2002. So it's come and gone, and Jim always said he was going to come back to poetry. He wanted to, but he never quite wanted to more than he wanted to write the next novel. So he didn't come quite back to it. I will not pose as a critic of Jim's poetry because I've only had one, and I suppose it's a very wifely response to all of his poems ever since I first saw them. I like them all. The first poem of Jim's, actually I heard rather than saw. I came to the University of Montana and to Missoula in 1966. And that fall sometime, Richard Hugo, that greatest of all poetry teachers, had an office next to mine. And you know, one comes, one goes. And I was sitting in my office one afternoon, and he comes roaring into the door saying, "You've got to hear this." And he reads me a poem called In My First Hard Springtime. And that was the first I'd ever heard of this young man, and it was the first poem of the kind that he continued to write that Jim had turned into Hugo's workshop, and Hugo was simply blown away. So were other people. That's why Professor Bill Beavis's dog was named Albert Heavy Runner, was because there's a line in the poem, Albert Heavy Runner was never civic. I met Jim, I saw Jim in the hall sometimes with the other workshop students, Rick DeMarinis among them, and gradually, we got to know one another, but it wasn't till that fateful opening day of fishing season meeting at Onyx Smith's Valley of the Moon Ranch in 1967 that we actually got together. Got married in 1968, and all of this time he's writing poems. I run this through simply because he's writing poems. He'd come to my house for supper, and I'd grade papers after supper, and he'd sit with a clipboard beside the fireplace and write a poem or two. And for 3 or 4 years, that's just what he did all the time, is write a poem or two. It seemed like every night. And it was because of Richard Hugo's connection with the poetry editor, first of the New American Review and then at World Publishing Company, that he became interested, Stanley Moss was his name, became interested in publishing that book the first time. And it didn't have great reviews at that time. In fact, some of them were actually fairly snotty. But he did begin to give readings around the country, and that was a period of time when Native American writers were just beginning to be heard in the country. And so he was asked to go travel all over the country giving readings, and he did that for a number of years before he became a novelist. And that's all I want to say in a general way about this. And then what I'm going to do is to introduce these people first, just so that you know who they are looking down the aisle. This is Rick DeMarinis, who I put first because he was in a seminar, in a workshop with Jim, and so in some ways probably knows more about Jim as a budding poet than I do. Deborah Erling, also a Native American writer, and she was a student of Jim's when he taught 1 year at the University of Washington, and then again when he taught at Cornell. Bob Reed, an old friend and former poet, but of course changed to Mysteries, and is known especially to the French as the police chief. James Lee Burke came actually to the University of Montana the same time I did, and so I've known him for years and years, even sometimes he's been out of town, but you all know him as a great mystery writer too. Onyx Smith is, as I said already, the person who had the ranch where Jim and I first met, but she's been a friend ever since I got here, and of course is an author in her own right, but she has known Jim for all these many years. John Jackson is slightly newer to town. He was a student of mine many, many years ago. He too has turned to mysteries, but he's the jazz guy, the food guy, you know that about him. Then Bill Kittredge, who also came slightly later than I did, who ran the writing program and taught at UM for years and years and years, and retired as the Regents Professor of Creative Writing, and of course has been a buddy all through these years, but probably most influential in terms of his importance to Jim was he did the first reading of Winter in the Blood, when it was just a little green draft, and told him how to make conversation actually work. For the compliment, Jim put a Father Kittredge into Winter in the Blood. And then our dear friend Ripley Hugo, who of course as Richard Hugo's wife, we've known since she came to town in 1973. And for years after all, Ripley and Rick and Carol and I all lived on the same street. And so she's been a fast friend for years and years and years. I keep saying years and years, but it has been years and years. And so it's my pleasure then to bring these poems back to the initial freshness that I remember when I first heard them. And so, Rick, if you would start off now. Would you like to come up here, or would you rather stay there?
What's best? What do you want?
It might be easy.
You guys want to do that? All right. Jim and I were in that same workshop as Lois had mentioned back in I think it was winter 65, 66. It was a hell of a long time ago. I mean, it's almost 40 years. Can't believe it. Well, I can believe it. Sorry. Jim liked to tell a story about himself that he was writing very poetic, romantic poems when he came to the university and entered Dick's workshop. And Dick set him straight and told him what his real subject was and all that. But that's not quite right, because I have the evidence here in my hand. This is a little pamphlet of poems that was put out by Voices International in 1966, where Jim has one of his first poems ever in it. And it's not on his true subject. He's not there yet, but it's not about flowers and billowing clouds and babbling brooks, you know, the goosing butterfly type poem. It's not that at all. It's called 3 Nights Running Mad. Last night, in a fit of rage, I tore my dog in half. It consoled me little to find that he was stuffed with newspapers and penny nails. He was a fine dog. I will miss him. Tonight, I lay in bed searching for a line as blue and as straight as Aunt Cora, but my mind wandered over stubble fields in winter and heard the wires hum through ice. It was a heady winter. It will never return. Tomorrow night, I will dream of chocolate cake with little soldiers, knapsacks and ear flaps sprinkled in the snowy frosting, eating K-rations under the glow of 25 candles. Not bad. Not bad at all. And there's anger there, but it's unfocused anger. You know, growing up Indian in Harlem, Montana, or practically any place in the High Line, anger is probably the same response to that experience. I knew a Presbyterian minister in Havre who, during the Depression, there was no safety nets back then. There was no welfare programs, no social security. So the churches generally took care of people who were starving to death. And this Presbyterian minister used to make people pass a morals test before he'd give them food. And a lot of the people were Indians from Rocky Boy, and probably the majority in a way. But he was an equal opportunity bigot. He also made the whites pass the morals test too. You know, do you drink? Do you smoke? Do you sleep around? No, he wouldn't say sleep around, but are you living in sin? That sort of thing. So it's reasonable to expect Jim's poems to have a lot of anger in them, and they do. They do. And if you didn't know Jim personally, if you knew him only through his writing, you'd think that he was one serious fellow. In fact, you might think that his personality was forbidding, even unapproachable, but he wasn't. He was very funny. He was hilarious at times. He loved to joke around. One time, when I was living away from Missoula, he sent me a letter with a clipping in it from the Dear Abby column, and it said, "Dear Abby, on our wedding night, my bride said, 'It's been such a beautiful day, darling. Let's not spoil it with sex.'" And he said, "DeMarinis, I want you to put this guy in your next short story." Anyway, in Dick's workshop, he did focus on his real subject, and his imagination focused in on his true subject, which is his life growing up. And I'll read you one of those poems. Well, what did I do now? Here it is. It's called Harlem, Montana, just off the reservation, and you'll see the anger in it. We need no runners here. Booze is law, and all the Indians drink in the best tavern. Money is free if you're poor enough. Disgusted, busted whites are running for office in this town. The constable, a local farmer, plants the jail with wild, raven-haired stiffs who beg just one more drink. One drunk, a former Methodist, becomes a saint in the Indian church, bugs the plaster man on the cross with snakes. If his knuckles broke, he'd see those women wail the graves goodbye. Goodbye, goodbye, Harlem on the rocks, so bigoted you forget the latest joke, so lonely you'd welcome a battalion of Turks to rule your women. What you don't know, what you will never know or want to learn, Turks aren't white, Turks are olive, unwelcome alive in any town. Turks would use your one dingy park to declare a need for loot. Turks say, bring it, step quickly, lay down and dead. Here we are when men were nice. The photo hung in the New England Hotel lobby shows them nicer than pie, agreeable to the warring bands of redskins who demanded protection money for the price of food. Now only Hutterites out north are nice. We hate them. They are tough and their crops are always good. We accuse them of idiocy and believe their belief all wrong. Harlem, your hotel is overnamed. Your children are raggedy-assed, but you go on, survive the bad food from the 2 cafes, and peddle your hate for the wild who bring you money. When you die, if you die, will you remember the 3 young bucks who shot up the grocery store, locked themselves in, and cried for days, "We're rich, help us, oh God, we're rich"? Fantastic poem. And this one, it's called In My First Hard Springtime. Those red men you offended were my brothers, town drinkers, Buckles Pipe, Starboy, Billy Fox were blood to bison. Albert Heavy Runner was never civic. You are white and common. Record Trout in Willow Creek chose me to deify. My horse, Centaur, part cayuse, was fast and mad and black. Dandy in flat hat and buckskin, I rode the town and called it mine. A slow, hot wind tumbled dust against my door. Fed and fair, you mocked my philosophic nose, my badger hair. I rolled your deference in the hay and named it love and lasting. Starved to visions, famous cronies taught Mount Chief for names to give respect to Blackfeet streets. I could deny them in my first hard springtime, but choose a maze to ride you down with hunger. Okay, those are fantastic poems. He was doing it right away in the beginning of his career, and he just went up like a skyrocket from there. Just amazing, amazing writer. I'll yield the floor.
Thanks, Rick. Next is Deborah Erling.
I'm honored to be here on this panel. I think it's such a rare opportunity to be on stage with people who are literally the heartbeat of the idea of a writer's community in Missoula, Montana, the people who brought breath and life and made it possible for writers such as myself to find a voice in this world. And James Welch, I'm honored to say, was my mentor. And he rescued me from a bad life. When I was 18 years old, I was a high school dropout, and I didn't have much of a chance really to do anything with my life. And I picked up a copy of Winter in the Blood in Spokane, Washington, in the Crescent department store, which had a little book center. We didn't even have Walden's at that time. no Barnes and Noble. No, the only independent bookstore was a used bookstore. And I remember picking up Winter in the Blood and reading it and laughing and rejoicing in that book, seeing this incredibly beautiful and harsh landscape banked up against, these people's lives that were so powerful and so poignant and at times so funny. And it made me believe. I was so ignorant at the time. I looked at Winter in the Blood and I said, I could write this book. And it's just been a lifetime of inspiration. Will always be a lifetime of inspiration to have known James Welch, to have had him as a teacher in my life. Few people can say that they've had a teacher who has changed their lives and who has become beloved. A teacher that you could actually, and I actually was able to say to Jim, I love you, because it was true. It was so dear to me. So I'm going to read a poem because it's in the part of a landscape that I love. I love Dixon, Montana, and I love the only bar in Dixon. So. The only bar in Dixon. These Indians once imitated life. Whatever made them warm they called wine, song, or sleep, a lucky number on the tribal roll. Now the stores have gone the gray of this November sky. Cars whistle by, chrome wind, knowing something lethal in the dust. A man could build a reputation here. Take that redhead at the bar. She knows we're thugs, killers on a fishing trip with luck. No luck. No room for those sensitive enough to know their beat. Even the flathead turns away, a river thick with bodies, Indians on their way to Canada. Take the redhead, yours for just a word, a promise that the wind will warm and all the saints come back for laughs. Thank you.
I wanted just to say of that poem that was kind of written on a dare. They'd gone, J.D. Reed and Hugo and Jim had gone to the Dixon Bar after a fishing trip, and they decided they ought all three to write a poem on it and then send it to the New Yorker. And they did, and they published it. And I haven't been to the Dixon Bar in years because when I go by it isn't open, and when it's open I don't go by. But I understand that there's still a copy of these three poems up there in the bar. You can do research. Our next reader is Robert Sims Reed.
Thanks, Lois. To echo Deborah, it's a great pleasure for me to be here and with all my cronies for more years than any of us wants to remember. It seems astonishing to look back on it. When I first came here and started to school, I have to confess I didn't know who Jim Welch was. I have this book that's very old now, and I guess technically they can say it's a first edition since the other one was trashed and sent to the Hudson. And I wouldn't have bought this book probably except Bill Beavis made me. I was in a class and it was called Poets and Prose. It was about writers that wrote poetry and fiction both. And so we bought this and Winter in the Blood and read them together. And it was interesting to me to go back through here. I've got all the graduate student margin notes. And they say very profound things like mystical, anonymous. What's another one here? I marked a few. Things try and fit together. They may or may not. That shows you how profound an experience graduate school can be. So anyway, it was just a kind of a find for me to realize that those notes were there when I pulled the book down again. And it was also, I remember when I read the poems the first time, it was very interesting to me, though, to read through them and then follow that with Winter in the Blood and see how that language the language of the fiction generated out of a reverence and a use of the language that I think was established, or it seemed to me to be established in the poems. And then he used that same technique to drive the fiction also. And that was the paper that I intended to write for that class. And I will someday. And I'll get rid of that incomplete that I have before the university discovers it and takes everything away from me. After I'd been here for a while, I'm not the chief of police, but I do work at the police department. The French are confused about that. But Jim and I, we had another relationship outside of writing, which we oftentimes, during the years that was in place, talked about more than writing, and that was that he was on the Board of Pardons. And so we would talk about kind of the before and after version of people. And it was very interesting to have those conversations because we both knew a lot of things that people had done and had done to them. And we shared a great interest isn't the right word, and fascination isn't the right word. I'm not sure how to describe it. I guess concern about the terrible straits that people can find themselves in, and how some people can survive those and some people can't. And you would have heard it if you'd overheard those conversations. This great deep reservoir of empathy for people that ran through Jim and runs through all the work also. So I wanted to read The Renegade Wants Words. We died in Zortman on a Sunday, in the square, beneath skies so blue the eagles spoke in foreign tongues. Our deeds were numbered, burning homes, stealing women, wine, and gold. No one spoke of our good side, those times we fed the hulking idiot, mapped these plains with sticks and flint, drove herds of bison wild for meat and legend. We expected no gratitude, no mercy on our heads, but a word, the way we rode naked across these burning hills. Perhaps spring breakup made us move and trust in stars. Ice, not will, made our women ice. We burned homes for heat, painted our bodies in blood. Who can talk revenge? Were we wild for wanting men to listen to the earth and plant only by moons? In Zortman on a Sunday we died. No bells, no man in black to tell us where we failed. Makeshift hangman, our necks, noon and eagles, not one good word. Thank you.
And next is James Lee Burke. I'm hearing stories I haven't heard before either, so this is good.
Thank you, Lois. And as Bob said, it's a great honor to be here and to honor Jim's work and his life. And he was a remarkable man and a gentle and good spirit, but always a man who was defined by a sense of humor. Jim had a great sense of humor. As a novelist, I have always been enormously in awe, there's no other word, of his novel, Fool's Crow. I believe it's one of the best books ever written by an American author. There's a peculiarity in our literary culture that people who are associated with a region are sometimes assigned the role of regional writers. And of course that would also include William Faulkner and Ernest Hemingway, even his stories about growing up in the Midwestern United States. I think that Fool's Crow ranks with John Neihart's best work, Black Elk Speaks, and A.B. Guthrie's The Big Sky, which I still feel are not simply the best books ever written about the American frontier, not the West, but the frontier experience. But Jim's Fool's Crow is an absolute masterpiece. The imagery in Jim's work, both his prose and his poetry, is unique in another fashion, at least I think. There's what people sometimes call magic realism at work in his art, but it's beyond that. Jim was one of those rare writers who seemed to tap into an Emersonian oversoul. It's not literary artifice. It's as though, like John Neihart, he's actually describing a mystical vision. And this is why I think his work is sometimes hard to define. It's greater than itself. It has an aura about it, a kind of Byzantine fire. And if you look at Fool's Crow, you discover in reading the first line that you've entered into a contract with a kind of metaphysical vortex. It takes you inside of itself, and it simply doesn't let go. Also, I think Jim's work was always informed by a moral light, a kind of pantheistic view of the world that again goes beyond what is simply a tactile experience. If he has any peer, I think it's Gerard Manley Hopkins. You know, it was Hopkins who reawakened our interest in metaphysical poetry. But anyway, Jim will always be a model for my writing, and I think that Fool's Crow is going to have a continued influence on everyone who writes about historical America. Jack Kerouac would take off his hat to that book, as I'm sure my old friend and mentor John Neihart would. There are two poems here that I wanted to read. The first is called Day to Make Up Incompletes. And even though it describes a young boy's experience, perhaps growing up in a rural area in...
He did that instead of writing finishing the incomplete.
Pardon?
He did that instead of finishing the incomplete.
Oh, okay. It's, for me, also like a reawakening of experiences in my own childhood, and it reminds me of the complexity of Thomas Wolfe, the North Carolinian, and his treatment of the pain that sometimes goes along with growing up, as well as the innocence. Because the day came, and now why not? Because I am older, that people fell dropping not hard or fast, but soft, like the cottonwood snow in my mother's yard, and the soft grasses of my father's fields swarmed before a thickening wind out of the north. I came, why not, to the conclusion of rain beating the shingle roof above my bed, and this day, like all my days, found me badly in need of encyclopedias and moths to tickle the itch from my burning feet. This other poem is called Gravely, and it illustrates for me what has always fascinated me about the people who are able to see symmetry in images that at first glance seem to be incongruous. You know, it's George Herbert who wrote, I think, in my mind, the best single line in English poetry. The sunlight on the garden hardens and grows cold. See how Jim does it, gravely. We watched her go the way she came, unenvied, wild, cold as last spring rain. Mule deer browsed her garden down to labored earth, seed and clean carrots. Dusk is never easy, yet she took it like her plastic saint grandly the day we cut those morning glories down and divvied up her odds and ends. daughters to burn sheets the following Monday. All over God's city, the high white stars welcomed her the way she'd planned, a chilly satellite ringing round the great malicious moon. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was grand. And the next reader is Onyx Smith. By the way, James Lee Burke, do you still have the necktie that you and Jim traded at a party one night?
I think so.
Oh, I know I have in the closet, Jim's. After midnight sometimes they'd get to telling jokes and get really buddy-buddy, and I remember this exchange of neckties.
Better than an exchange of necks. I don't know if any of you can see this picture. This is the picture of Jim Welch on the back of the first edition of Riding the Earth Boy 40, 1971, that was published. This is the Jim Welch that I first got to know. And he was a really darling, skinny, oftentimes drunk young man, full of energy and promise. And we invited him to this party. We were living at Rock Creek, and for the opening day of fishing season, because Jim was, as you all know, a terrific fisherman and loved to fish. And my husband Dave was teaching in the English department, and I said, well, you know, Lois Welch was teaching there. I said, have you invited Lois? And he said, well, I don't know that Lois likes to fish. And I said, invite Lois. And so we did invite Lois, and she came, and instead of catching a fish, they caught each other. So I've known Jim and Lois from a long, long time ago, and they were always friends and still are friends. And I want to read one of Jim's sort of more famous angry poems. It's pasted onto my bookcase, and it's getting a little bit kind of dog-eared and brown, you know, the way old paper is, because it's been there for so long. But I look at it every time I walk by. The Man from Washington. The end came easy for most of us, packed away in our crude beginnings in some far corner of a flat world. We didn't expect much more than firewood and buffalo robes to keep us warm. The man came down, a slouching dwarf with rainwater eyes, and spoke to us. He promised that life would go on as usual, that treaties would be signed, and everyone, man, woman, and child, would be inoculated against a world in which we had no part, a world of money, promise, and disease. But I couldn't end on that note. When I was looking through these poems and thinking about Jim, I came across one that I didn't remember, and it really struck me. It's sort of his, Robert Burns, his Wee Slicket Mousy poem. It's a poem about justice. It's called There Is a Right Way. The justice of the prairie hawk moved me. His wings tipped the wind just right, and the mouse was any mouse. I came away broken from my standing spot, dizzy with the sense of a world trying to be right, and the mouse a part of a wind that stirs the plains. Thank you.
I think Jim Welch was one of the first guys I met when I came to Montana in 1968, and he was an awfully easy guy to be around, I must say. I liked him a lot, and he was writing these wonderful poems, so I thought, well, you know, Jim Welch has got it made. He's already producing these terrific poems, well established. Lo and behold, you know, a couple of years later, he starts writing novels. Well, I kind of resented that, you know. why are you coming into my field? You've got your poetry, but not only did he come into that field, but he just blew us all away. And I'm like James Lee Burke. I have the feeling that of the writers that were here, probably James Welch was head and shoulders above the rest. He had at least produced with Fool's Crow one truly enduring work that would be probably the paradigm for Western literature in a way. So it was a gratifying thing to have known him. I always loved these poems. That's why I say, he didn't have to write anything else, having written not just these poems, but all the poems that he continued to write. The one that I would like to read for you, called Song for the Season. It was September 4th, I think, the night his light went out in the great bedroom on the lake. Moontime seared the junipers rimming the great house. September and the mountain ash was stopped quite cold, its spindly bowl going dead, as though the fingers of the quite dead man had pinched a vital nerve. Think of it. The man had done so much, and now even the trees would fold and wither at his icy touch. His small boat, tied securely to the dock, fiddled out across the lake its dirge. Too late he found that for the great as well as for the weak, the wrong instruments ease you out, and the coming on of autumn. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Bill Kittredge?
Well, I'm profoundly honored and touched to be here. Jim was one of the first. I came in 1969, so some of these people beat me, but Jim and Lois and Dick Hugo and a few people like that were among the first people I met when I came here, and I've always said I was enormously lucky. I was a guy off a ranch who got an MFA at Iowa, and I didn't know anything about universities. And I came to some place where these good friends took care of me and kind of saw me through a few years until I began to find my way. And one of the things I found with Jim and with Lois, but particularly with Jim, was I think Jim really had a sardonic, funny sense of humor. He was just wonderful. And he and I saw things alike and saw humor in things that maybe other people didn't see as too much humor in occasionally. But I loved him for that. And the second thing I loved him for was his seriousness when he stopped being humorous and the way he was so morally straightforward. There was just no baloney about Jim Welch, ever. Along about 1971 or two, out of nowhere, I can't imagine why this happened, Harper's Magazine asked me to review a series of Native American books, this Seven Arrows book by Hamanostus Storm, which is one of the books in this series that Harper's printed, along with Riding the Earth Boy 40 and Winter in the Blood, was one of the books I remember. There were a couple of other Native American books. And I was honored and pleased to be able to title the review. This was my big breakthrough in the world, I thought at the time, from the last line of this poem of Jim's. And the poem is Going to Remake This World. Morning and the snow might fall forever. I keep busy. I watch the yellow dogs chase creeping cars filled with Indians on their way to the tribal office. Grateful trees trickle the busy underside of our snow-fat sky. My mind is right, I think, and you will come today for sure, this day when the snow falls. From my window, I see bundled Doris horsemen, black in the slowing snow, her raving son, Horace, too busy counting flakes to hide his face. He doesn't know. He kicks my dog and glares at me, too dumb to think thank the men who keep him on relief and his mama drunk. My radio reminds me that Hawaii calls every afternoon at 2. Moose Jaw is overcast, 12 below and blowing. Some people, listen, if you do not come this day, today of all days, there is another time when the breeze is tropic and rifts the green sap forever up these crooked cottonwoods. Sometimes, you know, the snow never falls forever. And that was the line I used at the end of that, and I was so proud to know the guy who wrote that, and to, you know, I think that the man who wrote those lines early on, later on, had, you know, the moral intensity to give us all those great novels. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you keeps being such a small word for such moments. I will conclude with Ripley Hugo.
It's good to have everyone here hearing Jim's poems. I can't see you, but I can tell you that I just lost a button off my favorite reading shirt. That might tell me something. And this is my favorite reading tie because Jim used to tie the knot for it. Lots of things to say. I'd like to read first. Am I talking into this properly? I'd like to read Snow Country Weavers. A time to tell you things are well. Birds flew south a year ago. One returned, a blue-winged teal, wild with news of his mother's love. Mention me to friends, say wolves are dying at my door, the winter drives them from their meat. Say this, say, in my mind I saw your spiders weaving threads to bandage up the sky, and more, those webs were filled with words that tumbled meaning into wind. And one more I'd like to read. This poem is called In My Lifetime. This day, the children of Speak Thunder run the wrong man, a saint unable to love a weasel way, able only to smile and drink the wind that makes the others go. Trees are ancient in his breath. His bleeding feet tell a story of run the sacred way. Chase the antelope naked till it drops, the odor of run quiet in his blood. He watches cactus jump against the moon. Moon is speaking woman to the ancient fire, always woman. His sins were numerous, this wrong man. Buttes were good to listen from. With thunder hands his father shaped the dust, circled fire, tumbled up the wind to make a fool. Now the fool is dead. His bones go back so scarred in time. The buttes are young to look for signs that say a man could love his fate, that winter in the blood is one sad thing. His sins I don't explain. Desperate in my song, I run these woman hills, translate wind to mean a kind of life. The children of Speak Thunder are never wrong, and I am rhythm to strong medicine.
Excuse me. I know that Jim would have been honored at this celebration. I know he would have been pleased to have this new book out. I know he also would have been a little embarrassed because he would say, those poems are so old. I know he'd be honored, but I know he also would have been embarrassed because he never felt that he should make a commotion about himself. But that didn't mean that he wasn't enormously proud of how his work touched people and continued to go on its way, and I hope that it will. And I'm so glad that you were here, and I'm enormously touched at what my friends and Jim's friends have done today. And I just want to point out that on the program tomorrow, I know that at 9:30 there's a discussion on teaching Fool's Crow at the public library, and then here tomorrow afternoon at 2:30 a celebration of Jim, which, I'm glad it goes on. There is, for those of you who might be interested, there will be a pair, Jim's French sandals will be at the silent auction, if you want to walk in his shoes. Thank you.